Hello, this is Daniel Ludvigson with Elgin New Leipzig Public School. And if you are watching this, you are watching the talk on dual administrative roles. What is it like? The reason I'm doing this presentation is I have been a dual role administrator for going on 9 years now. I started my career as a K-12 principal with other duties as assigned. As you can see from the list, my other duties as assigned attained a comically long list, which is why I like to refer to it as other duties assigned. So transportation coordinator, 504 coordinator, MTSS coordinator, public school manager, foster care liaison, manager of the pop machine, and I'm sure if I put a little thought to it, I could come up with a few more things, and I'm sure you could as well if you're watching this. Good chances you might be a dual administrator or considering it. A lot of you might be from small schools where you might have done a dual teaching role or had combinations like that. I do think there's some special challenges when you take on more than one leadership role. As my picture indicates, there's a bit of a push and pull with how your priorities are lined up. When I was that principal, I was an art teacher too, so I know that side of it. If you happen to be like a school board member or something like that, what I would like you to get out of this is understanding what it is that you're asking somebody to do when you ask them to be a dual role administrator. Let's continue. So why do schools go to a dual administrative role at all? Typically, the biggest reason usually is cost savings. Another one is a lack of applicants. It's often hard to find a good quality administrator, even in the best circumstances, and in particular, if you got kind of a short notice retirement or a late quit or what have you, you might be hard pressed to find any candidates at all. And so sometimes the combining roles becomes a matter of necessity. Obviously, decline of numbers can play a role as the amount of load that you're dealing with shrinks. But I do caution you, if you're kind of looking at that kind of reasoning, that also look to see if the actual duties are declining with the enrollment, because it's not really a perfect one-to-one relationship. Obviously, there is some changes if the size of the district changes, but it's not, like I said, a one-to-one ratio. The other one I like to say is a bit of a misunderstanding about what school administrators do. A lot of people, if you ask them what a superintendent does, they probably really couldn't tell you. You ask my kids, they say, attends a lot of meetings and plays with money is probably what they would tell you. But there's a lot more that goes into that, and there's a lot that administrator does with reporting, keeping up with current trends and stuff like that, that you don't get to see. It's not the time they spend writing an article for a paper, being at a gym lyceum talking, or handling a discipline issue. So a lot of those job duties that a superintendent or a principal does, or like a special education director, isn't always visible. You're not always going to see them working on it. And there's a tendency when you don't see it to assume that it's not a major thing to deal with. And as I get in later, you have to be careful that you're not piling on to your administrators. So the reason I point that out is you have to be pretty careful that you're not giving an unrealistic workload, or that you're not accepting an unrealistic workload. When I went to Munich, it was my very first administrative career job. And let's just, in the spirit of honesty, say that your first job, if you throw an administrator head first and he can't swim, so to speak, like it could end his career in administration because it gives him a bad name. Could make your school look bad if they're going through administrators because they can't handle that kind of workload. It's too much. So like, it is important to put that into consideration. So pros and cons. There obviously are pros and there are cons to having a dual administrator. Obviously, the first one, as discussed before, is it's cheaper. Less people, generally less money towards it. I would caution that you get what you pay for, so make sure that that makes sense. The wider breadth of involvement in the school operation, what I mean by that is that since somebody has multiple roles, like I was saying before, you kind of get your fingers dabbled in more things. Like you have some experience in the classroom, you have some experience in the kitchen, you know what issues the bus drivers are going through. You have a pretty wide breadth of what it takes to run a school and what people have to do who are running a school. So it gives you kind of that personal knowledge, and I do believe that if you are a small school administrator and you have multiple roles, that you do gain some knowledge from that you might not get at a bigger school where your duties are more concentrated and you perhaps don't get into the nitty-gritty of other things. For example, for me, working at a small school, I get into quite a bit of the STAR reports. So when I went to Elgin, New Leipzig, I was able to help the secretary with some tricks and tips on how to do that. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was in a job where it wasn't necessary because those duties are already doled out. And of course, having less human capital is an advantage at times. If you don't have a big list of quality candidates and you don't want to hire the first person that you check that has a pulse and a license, sometimes it's better to combine positions with the competent people you do have. And like I said, sometimes situations arise where you don't really have a lot of time to readjust or look for applicants, and you do want your administrators to be good. So sometimes it's simply a short-term thing. Cons is if you're going to hire somebody to be a dual role administrator, that you really need a strong administration. So like in my current situation, I have a veteran principal under me, and I think that's important because I don't have to spend a lot of time trying to mentor him or direct him. I need time to figure out how to juggle my own job duties. So you don't want a bunch of brand new administrators and then stacking administrative titles onto them. Now, I wouldn't discourage you from, if the job is genuinely part-time, splitting it between some teaching duties and things like that. But there's a different level of organization, which I'll get into later when you talk about an administrative role. The other thing is a leadership bottleneck. So, for example, in my position, I am both the elementary principal and the superintendent. So if somebody has an issue with the elementary principal, it kind of has a straight V line to the board president because I am also the superintendent, so you can't go up that chain of command. So there's not that separation of duties, and at times that means that you can't follow a normal chain of command because there's missing pieces in there. And that's just the way that is. When you have dual administrative roles, a lot of times there is kind of a competing responsibilities. So what are you giving more attention to? For example, I some days have to decide if I'm going to get into classrooms and do observations or finish the federal reporting to claim money. And a lot of times with these dual roles, you kind of have to decide one's going to maybe not be done to your standard. It's just going to get done, and something else is going to get more of your attention. And as long as people understand that, that's all right. But sometimes you get into these dual roles and people think you're supposed to do everything 110%, but it's just not doable. So I said breadth of involvement improves, but depth sometimes suffers. So meaning how deep your knowledge runs into just be doing the principal duties can suffer because, like I said, you have to cut some corners sometimes because you need to get both jobs done. So sometimes the priority becomes getting the job done rather than getting the job done to your highest professional standard. And those of you listening who are doing this, like it's not something to feel bad about. It's just the nature of the beast. Like there's just only so many hours in the day, and some of them you need to spend with your family, or you're going to be no good to anyone because you're going to be stressed out and burnt out. But one of the things that you need to juggle is prioritizing. And so sometimes some of those jobs on that list have to get done to a lesser degree. When you do share administrative roles, it's a bit harder for the administrator to be gone. For example, when I was in Munich, I was the K-12 building principal. And sorry there, hit a button. And I was the superintendent was part-time. So when he was gone, I kind of became de facto superintendent. So if he was gone for a short, I was gone as well. That became a bit of a problem because, you know, there was a lack of administrators around. On the other hand, I mean, if you have strong teacher leadership, sometimes you can tap into that for those sorts of things. So sometimes evaluating your staff can be an important part of deciding whether or not a dual administrative role is right for your school. And the last thing I wanted to touch on there is it requires excellent time management skills. And the reason I put that on there, any administrator needs excellent time management skills, and teachers need good time management skills. But when you're juggling multiple roles in particular that have different emphasis and direct your mind in different ways, then that challenge becomes even harder. Because simply keeping track of the duties you have when they're coming up is just harder, because they're varied and dissimilar. Every human's brain is kind of like a plate. You can only fit so many things on it before it becomes overloaded. And at that time, something has to come off it, and that's the thing you forgot. So when you have a dual role administrator, they need to be able to have systems in place to prevent them from forgetting things or misplacing or deadlines or that stuff. And it can't all be up here. I'll get more into that later. But the time management is really necessary if you're going to have a dual role administrator. So what is it like? So this is a little bit of humor. It can feel at times that you have a bit of a split personality. And that's what I mean with the dual roles and responsibilities, that sometimes you feel like you have to act this way for this part of your job, and sometimes you have to act that way. For example, when negotiations roll around and I'm both the elementary principal and the superintendent, I sometimes feel a conflict of, you know, showing the support for my teachers and backing them, and then needing to be the advisor to the board, which is a struggle that any superintendent's going to have. But with the principal role added onto it, there's going to be a little bit more spillover. But I will say that, you know, having a dual role can keep the job interesting. It makes it fast-paced and demanding. And like I said, you have kind of a wide breadth of involvement in the school, so things are always interesting, just like in any administrative role, but just imagine cranking it up a little bit. And as I said before, in particular, when you are trying to balance two administrative roles, that it is a bit more interesting than trying to balance, say, being a teacher and administrator. If you are a dual role administrator right now, I'd encourage you to reach out to somebody else that has experiences doing this. Kind of the de facto result of combining roles is usually there's nobody else that has that same job duty that you can kind of share what your experiences are with. Here, the close thing is my principal is also the athletic director. So we both deal with dual roles quite a bit, but like the nature of our two combinations are a little different. So finding somebody that you can kind of bounce off and kind of navigate that split of personality can be a bit of a challenge. So we'll continue on to organization is not useful, it's essential. And I wanted to emphasize this in this presentation because it was I was an organized teacher before I became the K-12 building principal in Munich. Like I had lesson plans for snow days and stuff. And I remember people thinking that was like crazy. And so like I knew when dates were coming up, and the system I had to organize myself at that time was perfectly sufficient. And then when I became a K-12 principal with other duties as assigned, as I said, like it became extremely difficult to keep up with things. And the organization systems I was using was not suiting my needs very well. At that time, I would sort things by the category. So, you know, I had a binder for being a principal, art teacher, transportation director. As you can imagine, there's quite a few. The problem with that kind of system, and something I'm personally recommending here, was that I didn't know at a specific time if I needed to pull out which of the 12 binders to tell me what I was doing for that particular job. And so one of the important switches I made to was organizing not by category, but by due date and time. So I started implementing it's a folder system. I forget the name of it. But I participate in organization training from the Principal Center, Justin Bader. It really make a huge difference. So if it wasn't for that, I might have left education because it was getting very, very hard to balance my life and keep track of things. And when things get away from you, you can feel a bit like things are out of your control and spinning. And sometimes it's hard to come back from that. But an important piece of advice I got for somebody going into administration, in particular, if you are doing a dual role, is to understand we all have struggles with organizations. We all have issues we deal with. And when, for me personally, I started realizing that, this is something that other people struggle with too, and they have to put systems in place. I did a lot better simply adjusting my strategies rather than beating myself up for not having the same organization as I perceived other people having. So whatever systems you use, it needs to be something that works for you. Like I said, it didn't work for me sorting things out by different titles. Future folder, that's the system I use. I use my phone for a lot of alerts to block my time. So I'll save an hour to do this or that and try to prevent myself from switching between tasks so much. Because that's one trap that's pretty easy to fall into when you're a dual role administrator, is you got 5 or 6 competing things you need to get done, and you start working on one and then the other and back and forth and back and forth. And that's when you start missing things and you miss details, or you miss a due date because you're constantly switching between things. If you study this at all, like, there's no true thing as multitasking. What your brain's doing is it's devoting attention to this, putting a bookmark in that. And then when you get done with this, we open the bookmark back to here. And some of us are better at that than others. Some of us can kind of keep something in the back of their mind. I'm not particularly good at that, so keeping lots of reminders is good. If you have a good school secretary, this is something that they can really help with by, I share my calendar with my school secretary so she knows where I'm at, what I'm doing, that sort of thing. So it's important to kind of look at your work habits when you're a dual role administrator. Make sure they're working for you and not against you, and that you have a system that helps you maintain the quality of your work. Because that feeling of that you're having trouble keeping everything on the plate and trying to juggle it can get a little overwhelming. So just kind of a word of warning that in any job, that the level of organization for administrator is quite high, but when you start stacking dual administrative, it gets even more complicated. And you can find an administrator that was an administrator at a bigger school and one at a smaller school that had to juggle multiple job titles, and they would tell you that this is true. So I kind of was alluding to it before, but prioritizing and delegating becomes essential. So this is a good time for a Delbert little graphic there. As you can see, his little board there says essential, critical, and must have, and he's asking you which one you want him to work on. And I very much wanted to include this one in this presentation because we as educators, in particular, teachers, administrators, counselors, what have you, occasionally develop what I like to call a Superman or Wonder Woman complex. We think we need to personally solve it all, that if we're not at work, the building's going to burn down. If we don't personally handle something, catastrophe is going to strike. And it's not a great mindset if you're going to try to be a dual role administrator. And the reason for that is you simply can't do it all. And if you hold everybody to the exact same standards that you have, you're going to have trouble delegating. Now, some people are going to go above and beyond your expectations. Don't get me wrong there, but it will severely limit your delegating if you want to take it over, they don't do it exactly how you think it needs to be done. So I kind of mentioned secretaries earlier. They're very important because they can help you redirect people. So like if they stop somebody and ask them, what is it that they want, and they want to ask something about the sports schedule, well, they can direct them over to the athletic director. if they have a question about some homework policy, they can direct them to the teacher instead of trying to go straight to the superintendent with an issue that you're ultimately going to redirect them anyway. So having a secretary that's going to stop people and ask them, or tell them that you're, in a meeting, conference, whatever, and that they'll need to wait or they'll need to schedule time. Somebody that's willing to help you guard your time and help you organize it a little bit. They are essential. And so I'll just kudos to all the administrative assistants out there. The work you do is very valuable. And part of the reason you want to avoid guard your time is to avoid time sinks. Chances are you probably don't have a lot of time to end up devoting to something that is ultimately going to not be a good use of your time. So part of the reason you need a good organization system is that you can tell if you're not going to have time to get back to something so that you know to delegate it. So if you're keeping good track of your to-do list and things that need to get done, even just being aware that you keep putting something off will help you realize that you need to delegate something. And some of these reasons are why your depth of knowledge suffers. You really can't be a jack of all trades. You do have to be able to rely on your team members, and if you're going to hire somebody to be a dual administrator, they have to be somebody that's comfortable in punting different tasks and duties to other people and willing to have like a secretary help them guard their time and things like that. A micromanager is not a good person to have as a dual role administrator. I would argue that you don't generally want a micromanager anyway, but it's particularly hard if somebody's going to be trying to tackle a dual role administrative position because like you can't do it all. So this slide is specifically about, if you got like a superintendent position lined up with a principal, so sort of that like higher and a dual role combination where they're the next person up on the ladder. So some common problems can become like, who does the evaluation? As a principal, there isn't a superintendent to do the evaluation, and if you ask the School Boards Association, your school board is really not qualified to evaluate you as a principal. So how do you handle that? What's your contract going to look like? Are you going to have one contract or two contracts? Also, the chances of a conflict of interest being involved become a little bit greater. Like you have a board member that has a kid in a particular class and they get in trouble and you have to handle the discipline. So there's more room for things to get intertwined. That's why I say conflict of interest. It's kind of my example there. And disruptions in chain of command, as I mentioned earlier. Grievances, another one. But so evaluation is something that a lot of these schools will have to deal with. And I'm not saying our school does it in the correct way, but what we do here in Elgin New Leipzig is I send out a survey to the teachers that I supervise with different items from a rubric, and they kind of rate it, and I do a self-reflection, and I share that with the board, and they just kind of approve it as I went through the process. I don't think there's really a set method, but that one's sort of one of those 360 evaluations, I believe is what they like to call it. You do want to get input from somewhere and get some sort of feedback. You don't want to just say, oh, well, we'll just evaluate him as the superintendent. You should get some feedback in the other roles, whether it be the special ed director or different things like that. You still want that to occur. Make sure you're doing your due diligence. One other one I find kind of interesting in a superintendent elementary principal combination, and probably other combinations, is when the negotiations roll around. As I said before, contentious negotiations can kind of spill into like your staff meetings, for example, and people having kind of bitter feelings towards you because they feel like you should do this or that, or they didn't. I thought you should say more at a negotiation meeting about something, whatever it is. As a principal, a lot of time we're given advice, just kind of keep that as on a 9-foot pole, just stay away from it. But you won't have that option if you're also the superintendent. You're the advisor to the board. You're advisor to the teachers as well. But ultimately, your boss is the board. So negotiations can become a tricky time of year. It's also that time of year as a principal, a lot of times you're talking about curriculum changes for next year, and I'll just be straightforward. Negotiations can become a massive distraction to some of those things if they are contentious. Maybe you have a school district where they usually go really smoothly and it's not really an issue, but like on those years where you don't have the money, it's seldom a pleasant experience. Now with grievances, like you're going to have to follow your chain of command. So if there's a grievance filed against you as an elementary principal, it's going to have to jump up to the board president, which is why it's really important that you have a good relationship with your board if you're going to do a dual administrative, or if you are a board member, to be very supportive of your administrator. You don't want the grievance procedure to become some sort of weapon to get back at your dual role administrator, because they know that it's pretty much got an expedited trip to the top, so to speak. And I don't know any way that you can really get around that, but just, you know, be supportive of one another, communicate, and try to handle it the best of your ability. This is a good time to mention that if this is a superintendent elementary combination and you're a board member, it's really important that you guys function as a unit, as a board. If you have a lot of people kind of going out on their own and with their own individual agendas, it can make that dual role a little bit harder to juggle those different things going on, because that superintendent's attention is also divided up with the principal duties. So being on the same page will really make that, like for any district, it's going to make it a lot smoother. But in particular, if you're trying to do that juggling act, you don't need more complicating it. Now, I'm no expert on contracts. I'm not going to pretend to be. But before you sign up to be a dual role administrator, before you make a dual role administrative position, you really need to talk about what that's going to look like. Now, some school districts will have two separate contracts. They'll have one for the superintendent, one for the elementary principal. I assume that is to keep like continuing contracts separate and things like that. The advantages of having it into one contract is that it's one contract, kind of spells out everything in one place. Because sometimes the features of one position and another position can be incongruent, they don't really mesh. For any of the schools out there that are combining that have administrative positions, I do highly recommend that you keep your contracts for your administrators separate from your teachers. Administrators are governed under different parts of Century Code, and superintendents definitely. So having that combined with a teacher contract would call in a lot of question on how the negotiated contract for the teachers plays into the administrative contracts. And since the administrators can't negotiate as a teacher, you could end up with a situation where the teachers are negotiating features of the administrative contracts, in which the administrators really don't have a say, or, you know, like it just makes it less complicated. It's best to keep those contracts separate because they're governed by different things and the negotiations are different. If you did not know that your administrators, if you're in a small school, they can petition to negotiate. And another important part of that is just being clear about what roles you're giving to the administrator. I remember my first K-12 position, there was a few times where somebody asked me why I didn't do X, and I basically said I didn't know I was supposed to do X. That was news to me. So having that conversation, if you're making the dual role position, or even if you're taking, what exactly is your job? What duties fall under that? Now, chances are it won't be comprehensive because there's lots of small ins and outs, but be aware of what you're asking somebody to do or what you're accepting to do. That's one of the things that can help you have a reasonable workload expectation. So one of the things that can happen when you have this sort of stacked administrative roles is sort of a large number of decisions falling on the back of one person. So when you're talking about a small school, there's usually not a whole lot of administrative roles to start with. So when you combine them, a lot more things are going to fall on one person. And sometimes this can breed contempt, and a lot of times that happens with the superintendent position anyway. They can develop this sense that they're calling all the shots or things like that. Or that since everything needs to flow through them, they kind of got their fingers in everything, and that's something that that person needs to be aware of, or the board that is making a position needs to be cognizant and careful of. It doesn't really require that be true, that for that conversation to happen in your community. Just a sense that things are all flowing through you. For example, when I had that K-12 building principal job, and then the superintendent was gone for portions of the time, certain things were attributed to me that I didn't have a role in making a decision of. And that's just the way it is. And like I said, a lot of times as a superintendent, there's that sense anyway, but just something to be aware of. Being an island. A lot of you may be familiar with that the administrative job is a lonely job. Well, this only gets compounded by the fact when you do a dual administrative role. Like I said, even in my area, even if I go out to the area schools, there's only one other superintendent that's also an elementary principal. And I know they don't do the job the same way I do it. So like your number of colleagues that you can bounce off what you're dealing with was small, and then it gets even smaller. So finding somebody that you can relate to with the challenges you're dealing with can be very difficult, but also very essential. So you need to have good networking skills and be able to reach out and develop like mentor relationship or collegial relationships where you can kind of bounce the situations you're dealing off with. And it's a little bit different than another administrator. For example, if I send out a question on the listserv to all the superintendents of state, I might get some responses from larger school districts, and they're not really practical in my situation because, you know, I might say, get your human resource officer to do such and such. Well, that's also my business manager and whatnot. And I don't have a person that has specifically this job title or whatever. So reaching out to people that have to juggle similar things can really help. And as I said, that when you're kind of the only administrator, there's more of a chance of being perceived as calling all the shots. So you kind of want a person that is good at delegating and collaborating. And if you have a stronger teaching staff, that can really play to this advantage as well. You have teacher leaders that can take on different leadership aspects, and you get an administrator that's good at delegating and collaborating. That's a better situation than if you get a micromanager and a staff culture that's maybe a bit more silo based. So kind of evaluating your school and where it's at can be important for determining if the dual role administrator is for you, to see if the position is too much of an island or those sorts of things. And as a caution for those people taking a dual role administrative position in a small school where they might be also the superintendent, you very much become the face of the school, and that's going to be true no matter where you go. But it's really a bit more of an intimate. I mean, people are going to recognize you on the street when you go to church, that sort of stuff. And so if they have a problem with the school, you might get jumped at the grocery store and asked why this was done or that was done. It's just something you need to be aware of. And like I said, you have a collaborative culture and a dual role administrator that is comfortable with delegating and collaborating. Some of these things can become less of an issue, and I think the whole idea of a dual role administrator becomes more and more practical. But you do want to take a look at your school's culture. If you have a very isolated work environment with a lot of people working in silos and it's kind of separated, you do your job, I do my job, this might be a bit more of a difficult balance for you. Now, you probably want to change that in your school culture regardless if you're developing a dual role administration position. But keep in mind that like somebody's not going to be able to walk into your doors, flip a switch, and completely change your culture. I know like we like to popularize that in TV, but that takes years to do. So just be aware of it. Piling on. So if you look at psychology, it provides a little bit of feedback on this particular area. But the truth of it is that people who get things done tend to get things assigned to them. So like if you're in a dual role administration position and you are good at getting things done, chances are that you'll probably get asked to do more. A lot of times these extra initiatives and stuff that comes at school, they like, who's going to do this? Our teachers don't have time to be the foster care liaison or the COVID-19 coordinator or what have you. So, well, who can we assign to do that? Who has time? Well, we'll assign administration to that because, you know, they don't have classrooms, they don't have teachers, they have time to do it, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. And if you are going to become a dual role administrator, learning to say no, you can't do that is probably a valuable skill, because if you can't say no, the fact that you're a contracted employee, people may kind of treat that like it's an infinite amount of time. They're already paying you a high salary, you make the big bucks, so you should be able to do whatever we want you to do because you're the administrator. And that's also why you need to be able to delegate, because if you have to be in control of everything, the chances of you getting piled on with just one more thing is going to be much more likely to happen. If you can't kind of reflect on yourself and ask yourself, does this really need to be done by me? This is going to be a real problem for you. And as I said before, it requires a certain level of being able to allow somebody to do it their way, maybe not exactly the way you were thinking. Does require enough organization to see that, you know, you need to delegate it to somebody else. Like this isn't getting done because you simply don't have time in the day, and being able to advocate for yourself are important. The other thing to be aware of is that you probably most likely have more than one dual role in your school. So chances are there are other people that are probably your go-to people that have the tendency to gain little jobs here and there as well. So having that balance for your staff is important. And sometimes you have to add a position to kind of balance out those duties adding on. So you do have to be an advocate. I know when I was working in Munich, there came a point where, you know, I had a conversation with the superintendent and said, you know, I can't. I think it had something to do with sports and busing. And I said, I just don't have time to schedule this. I have all these other things to do. The business manager doesn't have time. And they finally decided to hire a part-time secretary. So sometimes you have to be able to have those like conversations about what's a realistic expectation of you. Normally I kind of end this with questions, but I'll just kind of recap on what we covered today. If you are somebody that's considering a dual role, you're going to want to make sure that you have very strong organization skills. You're going to see what kind of resources you have in that community. Are there other administrators in the area that do a similar job? Is there a retired administrator that can be a good mentor to you? My current role, the former superintendent, stayed in the community, so it's somebody that I can bounce ideas off to, have conversations with. Do you have the networking connections to have you have to have somebody that you can talk to about the stuff you're dealing with. Otherwise, it can feel extremely isolating and like you're just kind of left to your own devices. If you're a school looking at combining composition, make sure that you're asking something reasonable. Take a look at your school culture, see if it would be conducive to a combined role. Having a strong leadership that goes beyond just your administration, having strong teacher leaders as well can make that combination a lot more practical. And you want to make sure the job duties that you're combining can actually be done within the amount of time that you are allotting. So it's important to take a look at those job duties and make sure they're reasonable, because particularly if you're pulling in somebody that's brand new to administration and you're giving them a list of duties that they simply cannot do to a high level of quality, you can actually damage that person's career. And hope you understand that, and the people accepting a dual role can understand that. It can give you quite a wonderful experience in multiple facets of running a school, and kind of give you really a pretty well working knowledge of what it takes to make a successful school. But it also spreads you thin, and you cannot be a jack of all trades, and you have to fight that urge to be Wonder Woman or Superman. You have to be able to work with a team. You can't do it all on your own. And if you're a school board, make sure that you're supportive of your administration if you're going to do something like this. So feel free to email me if you so desire. My name is Daniel Ludvigson, and that's my email, daniel.ludvigson, Ludvigson @k12.nd.us. And so with that, take care, have fun, and stay healthy.